The mountains of Montana, in early spring, were a cruel beauty. Snow still clung to the highest peaks, a stark white against the emerging green of the lower slopes. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a landscape that whispered of both serenity and unforgiving power, a place where life could thrive and perish with equal swiftness. For Evelyn, this was supposed to be a reset, a chance to escape the soul-crushing monotony of her Seattle office, the endless emails, the fluorescent lights that seemed to drain the very color from her world. Her answer was a solo hiking trip, a week in the raw, untamed wilderness. At 32, she felt like she was sleepwalking through her life, and the mountains, in their silent grandeur, seemed to offer a promise of something more. She wasn't a seasoned survivalist, but she'd done her research. A sturdy backpack, a detailed map, a compass, high-calorie food bars, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and layers of warm clothing were her companions. She'd even splurged on a satellite phone, a small comfort, a tether to civilization in case of emergency. The first 2 days were exhilarating. The trails were challenging but manageable, and the views breathtaking. She felt a sense of accomplishment with every mile, a renewed connection to herself and the natural world. She pitched her tent each evening, the silence broken only by the crackling of her small fire and the distant call of a bird. She slept deeply, the exhaustion a welcome contrast to the restless nights in her city apartment. On the third day, the weather began to change. The clear blue sky was replaced by a heavy, ominous gray. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, their branches swaying like frantic arms. Evelyn consulted her map. She was still a good distance from her next designated campsite, but she wasn't overly concerned. She'd hiked in rain before, but this was no ordinary rain. It started as a drizzle, then quickly escalated into a downpour, a torrential onslaught that seemed to come from every direction at once. The trail, once firm and clear, became a treacherous ribbon of mud, slick and treacherous under her boots. Visibility dropped to near zero, the towering pines reduced to blurry shadows in the swirling gray. And then, the unthinkable happened. A sudden, violent gust of wind, stronger than anything she'd ever experienced, tore through the forest. A massive tree, its roots loosened by the saturated ground, groaned, cracked, and toppled directly in her path. Evelyn had only a split second to react. She lunged to the side, stumbling, her foot catching on a hidden root. She fell hard, the world exploding in a painful kaleidoscope of mud, rock, and splintered wood. When she finally came to, the rain was still pounding, but the wind had subsided slightly. Disoriented and aching, she tried to get up, but a searing pain shot through her left ankle. She cried out, collapsing back onto the muddy ground. Her ankle, it was twisted at an unnatural angle, swelling rapidly. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her initial shock. She was alone, miles from anywhere, with a serious injury. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of the storm. She was stranded. The first wave of despair was almost overwhelming. She huddled against the fallen tree, the rain soaking her to the bone, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She fumbled for her satellite phone, her fingers clumsy and trembling. The screen lit up but then displayed the dreaded words. No signal. No signal. Of course. Her carefully laid plans, her illusion of control, had been brutally stripped away. The wilderness, in its indifference, had revealed its true face. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, at the mercy of the elements and her limited resources. The first night was a nightmare. She managed to splint her ankle as best she could with some branches and duct tape from her first aid kit, the pain a constant throbbing reminder of her vulnerability. Hypothermia began to set in. her body shaking uncontrollably despite her efforts to stay warm. She rationed her remaining food bars, the meager calories doing little to combat the gnawing hunger and the relentless cold. Sleep came in fitful, shivering bursts, punctuated by the sound of the rain, the rustling of unseen creatures in the darkness, and the gnawing fear that gnawed at her resolve. She thought of her family, her friends, and the life she had taken for granted. Would she ever see them again? As the days dragged on, survival became her sole focus. The rain eventually stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the saturated trees. The sun, when it finally emerged, offered little warmth. Its pale light filtered through the dense canopy. Evelyn quickly learned that her biggest enemy was not the elements, but her despair. The pain in her ankle was excruciating, limiting her mobility. Her food was dwindling, her stomach a constant hollow ache. She began to question her sanity, the isolation playing tricks on her mind. She started talking to herself, her voice a weak, raspy croak in the vast silence. She told herself stories, sang fragments of songs, anything to keep the silence at bay. She even named the fallen tree that had become her reluctant shelter. Old Man, she called it, as if it were a sentient being. Desperation drove her to take risks she never would have considered before. She tried to crawl, dragging her injured leg, to a nearby stream she had spotted earlier, desperate for water. The effort was agonizing, the rough terrain tearing at her clothes and skin, but the thirst was a greater torment. She learned to identify edible plants, relying on her rudimentary knowledge and a tattered survival guide she had downloaded onto her phone. Miraculously, its battery still held a small charge. She caught insects, the protein a grim necessity. She even considered eating worms, but the thought made her gag, and she couldn't bring herself to do it. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, she saw something that made her heart leap with a surge of adrenaline. In the distance, through the trees, she saw a faint glimmer of light. Hope, fragile but insistent, flickered within her. It could be anything: a campfire, a cabin, a road, but it was a sign, a promise that she wasn't completely alone. With renewed determination, fueled by a desperate cocktail of hope and fear, she began to crawl towards the light. The journey was agonizing, every inch a victory against the pain and exhaustion. Thorns tore at her skin, rocks bruised her raw hands, but she pressed on, driven by the primal urge to survive. Hours later, as darkness descended, the light grew stronger, resolving itself into the warm glow of a cabin window. Smoke curled from a chimney, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else, something incredibly delicious that made her stomach growl with a ferocity she hadn't known it possessed. She reached the cabin, collapsing onto the porch, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. A dog barked, a rough, welcoming sound, and then the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face etched with concern. He was rugged, with a thick beard and kind eyes. "Jesus, lady, what happened to you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Help," Evelyn croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, help me." The man, whose name was Jedediah, was a recluse, a former park ranger who had chosen to live a solitary life in the mountains. He was gruff but compassionate, and he tended to Evelyn with a skill and gentleness that belied his rough exterior. He cleaned and bandaged her wounds, splinted her ankle properly, and fed her a simple but nourishing stew. He let her sleep in his spare bed, the warmth and comfort a luxury beyond words. He even managed to get a weak signal on his ancient radio and contacted the authorities. It took 2 days for the rescue team to arrive. As they carried Evelyn out on a stretcher, she looked back at Jedediah's cabin. a small, humble structure that had become her sanctuary. She knew she would never forget the kindness of this stranger, the warmth of his fire, the simple human decency that had saved her life. Back in Seattle, weeks later, Evelyn was a changed woman. Her leg was healing, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. The city felt different now. The noise and the crowds less overwhelming, the fluorescent lights less draining. She had seen the fragility of life, the indifference of nature, but also the resilience of the human spirit, and the unexpected kindness that could be found even in the most isolated of places. She quit her job, sold her apartment, and enrolled in a wilderness survival course. She didn't know where her new path would lead, but she knew she could no longer live a life devoid of meaning. The mountains had called to her, and she had answered. She had faced her fears, confronted her limitations, and discovered a strength she never knew she had. And in the process, she had finally begun to truly live.